Welcome to part 2 of the cross-cultural communication lecture. The concept of cultural chauvinism is a belief that one's culture is the best, superior to all other cultures. It involves feeling no need to learn about other cultures. Tolerance is an awareness of cultural differences. It recognizes that differences stem from ethnicity. There is no judgment of cultural differences as inferior. Now, in the past, we might have said we need to work toward tolerance. But my personal opinion is that tolerance really isn't enough. Tolerance is simply being aware of cultural differences and tolerating those differences. But I don't really think that's enough if we really want to achieve cultural diversity and understanding, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Minimalization is another way that we see individuals view people from other cultures. Minimalization involves minimizing cultural differences by emphasizing universality of human needs and behaviors. So an example of minimalization might be someone who says, "I'm colorblind. I don't see people's color." Now that might sound okay on the surface, but if we take a step back and really look at what that might mean, we're really devaluing individual cultural differences. And we know that diversity is enriched by unique cultural differences. And so if we devalue those and minimize those in favor of a universality approach, we're really kind of demeaning and demoralizing people who are not in the majority. Finally, understanding. When we talk about cultural understanding, we're recognizing that reality is in fact shaped by culture. So rather than minimizing culture, we're actually expounding on culture. We don't judge different cultural realities, and we recognize that people come to their own understanding based on their individual paradigms, and we understand that paradigms are uniquely influenced by culture. We also accept and respect cultural differences. So back to understanding communication. I thought this quote was quite apt for what we're talking about at this point. It says, "Nothing is so simple that it cannot be misunderstood." So it's important when we talk about communicating cross-culturally to check our perceptions. When someone's behavior is ambiguous and you're not sure what they're getting at, it's crucial to check your perceptions rather than just make assumptions about what they mean. So you would state what you've observed, offer possible interpretations, and ask for clarification. This is important when you feel like communication is muddy and you're not sure that what you're perceiving is in fact reality for that person you're communicating with. When we talk about the concept of proxemics, we're talking about personal space. So think about, in the U.S., our sense of personal space. We tend to appreciate about 3 feet around us when we're communicating. And I'm sure that some of you have probably experienced in the past what we might call close talkers, people who are really kind of in our space, and we just get a sense of not being comfortable because our personal space is invaded. Well, it's important to realize that this varies across culture, and in some cultures, personal space is much less, and in other cultures, the norm for personal space is much more. So it's important that when we're communicating with people from other cultures, especially in a counseling situation or a therapeutic setting, that we're aware of this and that we check ourselves, and that it may even be appropriate to ask what is comfortable for a particular client. Another concept is kinesics. Kinesics involves bodily movements, facial expressions, posture, eye contact, all of those things that are not verbal. Um, in the US, we have certain norms, and in social work, you tend to learn about ways to communicate actively, to encourage people to talk with you, things like smiling, having eye contact, nodding. Again, these are all culturally bound um, kinesics, ways of communicating non-verbally. And it's important to realize that in other cultures, for example, many Asian cultures do not value eye contact. And so if you're working with a client um, from an Asian culture that is not from the U.S., for example, an immigrant or a refugee, they may be made uncomfortable by constant eye contact. So again, communicating about what makes clients comfortable, about trying to be perceptive about bodily movements and the expressions that you make can be helpful in facilitating effective communication with others. Paralanguage involves characteristics of your speech. So, how loud you talk, how often you pause, if you use words in between the statements that you're making, um, things like that, inflections, how quickly you talk. All of these are things to be aware of when you're thinking about the ways to communicate effectively with different kinds of people. All right, I want to move on to high and low context communication. This is really an important piece of what I'd like you to take from this lesson. When we talk about high context communication, we're talking about communication that has nonverbal or situational aspects. So it's all of the stuff that is not said. It's kind of the stuff in the background that influences a message. When we talk about low context communication, we're talking about explicit verbal messages. So exactly what is said is meant. So we can look at these different concepts using a continuum from direct communication, which is also called low context communication, to indirect communication, which is called high context communication. So when we're talking about direct communication, we're talking about the degree of directness. If a culture communicates in a very direct way, people say what they mean and they mean what they say. So you don't need to read between the lines. It's important to tell it like it is. Honesty is the best policy, and the truth is more important than sparing someone's feelings. Now, the opposite end of that continuum is in an indirect communication culture, or a high context culture, where people imply or suggest what they mean. Understatement is valued, and you need to read between the lines. The truth, if it hurts, should be tempered. So kind of an example of this might be telling white lies. If you don't want to hurt someone's feelings, for example, if a person says, "Does this dress make me look fat?" and you might say, "Oh no, of course not." That's trying to spare someone's feelings in a indirect way. Okay, the role of context. In low context cultures, or direct communication cultures, we're talking about cultures that tend to be more heterogeneous, meaning made up of lots of different cultures, and more individualist. In a low context culture, you need to spell out the message. You need to be explicit, and you can't really imply or assume things are implied. Words are the primary means of communication, and nonverbal cues are not the key to understanding. In general, the U.S. fits the mold of low context communication. In a high context culture, we are looking typically at a more homogeneous and collectivist culture. A great example of this might be the Chinese culture or the Japanese culture, where much is already known, much is based on tradition and the assumption that the person who's being communicated to understands the importance of history and tradition. Spoken word is not necessarily the primary means of communicating, so much is implied, but little needs to be said. Many of you have probably heard of the concept of saving face. In U.S. culture, face has moderate importance. The facts and the expediency are more important than being careful about what you say. So you're not as worried about hurting people's feelings. Instead, getting or giving information is the overriding goal of the communication exchange. In U.S. culture, we typically provide what we call constructive criticism. We're not afraid, for example, in a business situation, to tell someone how they need to improve, what you're disappointed in, how you'd like to see things change. Whereas in an environment where face is key, saving face or not losing face is much more important than the truth. So the main thing is maintaining harmony, and confrontation is avoided at all costs. In the work that I do with refugee families from Burma, which is an Asian culture, often we run into problems when we are working at the clinic and we ask a family, for example, are you able to return to the clinic next week to be seen again? Almost never do we have a refugee, say no. Even if, for example, they have to work, or they don't have transportation, or they know for some reason they're not going to be able to return to the clinic, we almost never have anyone tell us no. And the reason for that is saying no is very difficult because they don't want to disappoint. And this is just a really important concept to understand when we're thinking about communicating with a culture where face is of primary importance and saving face is important. Okay, finally, when we talk about the task or the person, when we talk about what's most important traditionally in U.S. culture, we see the task as being separated from the person. So we do business first, and then we have small talk. So we establish rapport, but it's not really essential to getting the job done. The primary goal is accomplishing the task. And this is kind of the polar opposite of the idea of the person being the most important piece. The task and the person can't be separated in high context cultures. So the primary importance is developing a personal relationship and building that relationship. An example of this is several years ago when I lived in Hawaii and worked within the Hawaiian culture. If you would have a business meeting scheduled for 2 o'clock, you would expect people to arrive at 2 and do what is called talk story in Hawaiian culture, which is basically just to sit around, get to know each other, talk about family and friends and what's been going on in their lives. And this part may last for 45 minutes. But unless the talking story piece happened, no business was going to be accomplished. So it was important to build time for talking story into an actual meeting when you were scheduling that meeting. So in conclusion, it's important to recognize our professional and personal responsibility to be aware of the biases that happen in our communication with others and to recognize that cross-cultural communication is an essential piece of appreciating diversity and understanding how we can communicate with others in an unbiased way that promotes cultural competence in our society.